Good morning. It's a pleasure to be invited to give the keynote by Managers International Network, Nigeria, at the CSW 69. So, to my Nigerian sisters, a hearty welcome to New York. So, I was asked to speak to this subject: female leadership, gender-based violence, participation, and the dynamics of power and choice. And I came up with the title, She Leads: Power, Choice, and Courage in Africa, Unleashing the Potential of Women Leaders. I'm recording this for posterity so that actually my whole paper would be available for anybody that would like to read it. So here's my introduction to this important subject. In Africa, the pursuit of female leadership is a complex interplay of power, choice, participation, and voice, all in the shadow of patriarchal systems invested in gender-based discrimination, sometimes employing various types of gender-based violence, or GBV. So I'm going to just be calling gender-based violence GBV from now on. The dynamics of power and choice reveal that power influences the scope of choices available to women, and the choices of women influence their access to power. To truly empower women and enhance their leadership capabilities and participation in Africa, it is crucial to confront gender-based violence and dismantle the structural inequalities that perpetuate it. Here's, in my opinion, how these elements intertwine. That there's the intertwining of a cycle of disadvantage and a denial of agency, denial of access to power to women. So let me go into it. Breaking the cycle of disadvantage in the first place involves realizing that GBV creates a climate of fear and insecurity that limits women's access to education, economic opportunities, and political participation, all of which are essential elements for leadership development. GBV also reinforces harmful gender stereotypes, undermining women's credibility and authority as leaders. Second, on the question of choice and agency. Women's choices, such as pursuing education or seeking political office, can lead to empowerment and also greater access to power. Strategic choices, such as leveraging motherhood and traditional roles, building alliances, utilizing indigenous and modern institutions, and seeking education in other ways, because education goes beyond book knowledge. These are some of the strategies that women have conventionally employed to gain political power in our continent. We need to challenge power structures. This is the third element that I talk about. By overcoming male dominance, cultural constraints, and internal disunity among women. These are key challenges to female leadership. To address this, I suggest that we collectively and individually challenge the structures of domination that push women aside and trivialize their contributions. There are four interconnected factors that I would like to emphasize in this regard. First, structural violence is a root cause. Structural violence involves the pervasiveness of subliminal and obvious ways in which marginalized communities are oppressed, and how access to voice, to choice, and to power is denied them, and they're then blamed for this. This underlies many forms of inequality and insecurity. It is a primary reason for the vulnerability and marginalization of vulnerable groups, especially women and the poor. We need to redefine leadership, and I follow Professor Philomena Chioma's study in emphasizing the inclusion of motherhood qualities such as nurturance, compassion, and protection in African indigenous definitions of leadership. This quote-unquote mothering the nation approach humanizes the state and emphasizes integrity, consultation, and consensus building. Third, the colonial legacy. It bears repeating that colonialism had a negative impact on indigenous leadership, female leadership in Africa, eliminating or demoting women rulers and establishing structures that marginalized traditional female authority. Overcoming this legacy requires a comprehensive, historical, and humanistic approach that recognizes and transcends gender, race, class, and colonial legacies. Fourth is the role of African feminism. Of course, we should say African feminisms because there are many variants. African feminisms critically examine gender relations and strive to transform gender relationships in African societies to improve the situation of women. They emphasize cooperation with men, affirm motherhood and family, and offer nuanced critiques of patriarchal structures. So by addressing these four interconnected factors, African societies can create an environment where women are empowered to lead, participate fully, and exercise their choices without fear of violence or discrimination. So, what are the factors that marginalize African women globally? Drawing upon what I said earlier, the factors marginalizing African women globally include the following. 1. Religious paternalism and sexism. 2. Western secular hegemony, paternalism, and sexism. 3. Enslavement and colonialism, the enduring effects from these traumatic historical experiences. 4, the impact of structural violence. So, if we look at this impact of structural violence, I want us to see 3 intertwined aspects of it. First, it disproportionately affects girls and women due to gender-based discrimination and poverty. Second, it manifests in educational disparities, educational disadvantages, and harmful cultural norms. Third, it limits agency and perpetuates marginalization. So there is intricate complexity in female leadership in Africa, since multiple historical, contemporary, structural, cultural, and socioeconomic factors shape women's experiences and opportunities. We need systemic change, inclusive governance, and a culturally relevant approach to democracy to empower women and ensure their full participation in society. As I said before, on female leadership, I draw deeply from Professor Philomena Chioma Steady's work, and especially from her publication titled, her book titled Women and Leadership in West Africa, where she provides the definitions of leadership from a variety of perspectives. I'm also drawing on the thoughts of predominantly African and African-descended women on this important subject. My focus once again is on female leadership, gender-based violence, participation, and the dynamics of power and choice, drawing on examples primarily from Africa. And I'll talk about Nigeria to some extent, but what I'm going to say in this paper applies to the entire continent. I repeat, okay, so the central theme in this presentation includes definitions and styles of female leadership, the impact of colonialism, challenges and strategies for women in leadership, the effect of gender-based violence, and the importance of African feminism. Now, let me talk about the definitions and styles of female leadership. According to Professor Steady, indigenous African perspectives define a good leader as someone with integrity, confidence, charisma, fear of God, and commitment to social development. Western scholarship, according to her, defines leadership as imbuing a person with a vision and goals, as well as the skills to mobilize others. She also says that African indigenous definitions of leadership often include qualities of motherhood, such as nurturance, compassion, protection, and peace-loving tendencies. Female leadership styles often have transformative and servant leadership qualities, with connective and communal aspects. Female leaders are viewed as less aggressive, more consultative, more likely also to take responsibility when they go wrong. Male styles of leadership can be dictatorial, but they are also able to be used in building cohesion and strong networks. The point I'm making is this: female leadership should be understood from various perspectives, including indigenous African views and Western scholarship. They also address how female leadership styles differ from, the authors that I look at address how female leadership styles differ from male leadership styles. And I have given an example from the work of Professor Philomena Chioma-Steady. So the key aspects of the definitions and styles of female leadership include the following. Indigenous African perspectives define a good leader as someone with integrity, confidence, charisma, the fear of God, and commitment to the development and progress of society. A good leader should be moral, altruistic, caring, and willing to sacrifice for the good of society and future generations. Western scholarship defines leadership as imbuing a person with a vision of goals and the skills to mobilize others for the benefit of both leader and followers. Second is this focus on the qualities of motherhood. Again, according to Professor Philomena Chioma-Steady, African indigenous definitions of leadership often include qualities of motherhood such as nurturance, and I'm repeating here for emphasis, compassion, protection, and peace-loving tendencies. Let's be clear. When mothers must protect, they might be fierce. So, mothering the nation also emerges as an important element for humanizing the state. Essential qualities of female leadership, I'm going to say again, include integrity, which means less corruption, more consultation, and consensus building. Women also display significant moral fortitude, vision, and passion, and they are oriented towards society and building a durable future. Female leadership styles tend to have transformative and servant leadership qualities with connective and communal aspects. Female leaders are viewed as less aggressive, more consultative, and more likely to take responsibility when they make mistakes. Male leadership styles can be dictatorial, and male leaders may impose their will on others, but male leaders could also build cohesion and strong networks when they are more socially conscious and invested in building a future for the community, the nation, and humanity. Please bear with me while I reiterate a point that people often think is irrelevant. The impact of colonialism still looms large over the African continent. Colonialism generally had a negative impact on indigenous female leadership in Africa, disrupting the legacy of female leadership. Colonialism led to the elimination and or demotion of some women rulers, the replacement of indigenous women's organizations with westernized associations, and the marginalization of traditional female authority. Colonialism, third, supported and strengthened male hegemony, and some of the restrictions that we are still experiencing today reflect continuing influences from this era. Fourth, colonial officers sometimes manipulated indigenous leaders into signing treaties that ceded land to colonial rulers. Fifth, colonialism used forced labor and brutal extractive regimes to overexploit Africans and plunder the continent's wealth. So, what are the challenges that face female leadership? Those challenges include the following. I'm going to talk about 12. First is male dominance in politics and society. Second is cultural and traditional constraints that uphold patriarchy. Third is the lack of resources for women to seek and sustain leadership positions. Fourth, time constraints due to women's multiple roles. Fifth, internal conflicts among women and women leaders who, because of the conflict, refuse to support one another, but also between women leaders and women in the general public who refuse to vote for women as much as they vote for men. There also, number 6, gender stereotypes and misogyny. Number 7, resistance to gender equality and slow changes in homes to embrace the idea that women should have power, women should be respected, women should be equitably treated, and should have equitable access to resources. There's also number 8, balancing public and private life being very difficult for women. Number 9 is the colonial legacies that reinforce male hegemony. 10, poverty and underdevelopment. 11, lack of cohesion and solidarity among women. 12, female leadership in Africa, we can see then, faces a complex set of challenges arising from historical, cultural, and socio-economic factors. So there are key challenges that face female leadership. These 12 that I've mentioned, I'm now going to talk about them in some detail. First, the male dominance. Politics is still seen as a male domain, and men may not easily accept female leadership, even when they tolerate it. Men tend to favor other men for leadership positions. And in general, men do not accept female leadership, even though, they may be the he for she's. Some women compromise by establishing close links with men, and then they take on many of the characteristics that are rewarded within male dominant systems. And then people say, well, it's not just patriarchy. Yes, it is patriarchy, because it is a systemic thing that incentivizes people to act in the ways that they do in order to be rewarded or acknowledged as valuable by that system that might not necessarily be advantageous to women in general. But the women who comply then can be rewarded with those tokenistic positions and also praised as, as good citizens. Women who don't comply would then be called troublemakers and, all kinds of very disparaging names. Second, cultural and traditional constraints. Some customs and traditions uphold patriarchy and hold women back, despite laws that may be favorable to women. Some of these customs and traditions we need to identify, we need to struggle against, and we need to change. Third, gender stereotypes. Women leaders have reported in research that they had to manage gender-based stereotypes from both men and women and in the media. A female stereotype can undermine women's interest in leadership. Entrenched patriarchy legitimizes African men's control of the preponderance of power and wealth, and their lack of tolerance for strong, independent women. Fourth, lack of resources. Women often lack the capacity and resources to seek and sustain leadership positions. Limited resources is a very significant challenge that affects women directly as leaders. There's also the issue of time constraints. This is the fifth factor. Women play multiple roles within family, and combining this with roles that they have to play in public office creates time constraints, is a drain on energy, and is also a disabling factor, oftentimes, when women think about venturing into politics. Six are internal conflicts among women, both among women as leaders who may, because of negative interaction, may not support one another, or among, between women leaders and ordinary women, where there are mutual complaints about lack of respect, lack of support, and lack of acknowledgement of contributions to social well-being. So there's a need to build consciousness and solidarity among women. This continues to be a challenge because it is obvious that in many cases, there's this general tendency for women to be reluctant to vote for other women. Women are not manifesting oftentimes cohesion and solidarity as a group. And sometimes there's a lack of effective communication that would make it possible to build a large tent where women would collectively engage in a common struggle for ending gender-based violence, for ending discrimination against women, for ending stereotypical depictions of women, and for ending this assumption that women cannot lead. So without the cohesion, without the solidarity, the progress made will be very slow. Okay, there's also the issue of lack of effective communication and lack of sharing information. Some women tend to keep information to themselves, and they're not very good at sharing information and knowledge with other women. This must stop. Seventh, there's the issue of low representation, that despite the gains that may have been made in some countries in the African continent, in a country like Nigeria, it is clear that we have the issue of women being underrepresented in elected positions, in governance. And if this continues, it is a problem for development to happen in Nigeria and countries that have similar tendencies. Eighth is the issue of financial support. Women who want to enter politics often lack financial support. And, without the financial wherewithal, everything is difficult because there is a need to have the kind of resources that enable women to engage meaningfully and effectively in the political system. And if you have a political system where clearly the influence of money is valued, then women are at a disadvantage if they don't have enough money to engage. Okay, this related to this is the issue of poverty and underdevelopment. This is the ninth issue. The priorities of women are economic and they are geared towards ending poverty and underdevelopment, which can be caused or intensified by the destruction and exploitation of African economies, resulting both from the historical colonial rule as well as contemporary corporate globalization, which, in the main does not favor Africa as much as it favors other parts of the world. 10 is the lack of cohesion and solidarity. Women, as I said, and I'm repeating, lack this cohesion and solidarity. And, we need to work against that. There's a resistance, number 11, to gender equality, even with the progress made since independence and the contributions of women historically to the end of colonization as nationalists and also to national development. We don't see noticeable change, especially within the family, toward more equality and freedoms. So this needs to be addressed, in a meaningful way. 12 is the issue of work-life balance. Maintaining work-life balance can be a significant challenge for women. Women face double and sometimes even triple burdens or more with the challenges of reconciling their public demands and their private responsibilities. Heavy workload is a major challenge for many women, and many mandates from the international community about what needs to be done. The women's organizations that do this work are laboring under tremendous stress of limited staff and limited resources. And ministries of women's affairs or women's national machineries oftentimes are not as well funded as other ministries, which makes their work harder. Even within the United Nations system, UN Women is under-resourced. Okay, I want to add some more. There's the issue of lack of education as my number 13. I said 12, and now we're going into 13. A lack of education, especially for women, also impacts their opportunities for education. This goes beyond book learning to education that prepares people to engage life as meaningful actors with agency to understand what is wrong with the system they are in, and then to devise strategies and then implement those strategies for social transformation. Then, there's also the issue of resistance to quotas. And the Beijing Platform of Action recommended that there should be a 30% quota for women in government. Nigeria's gender document says this should be 35%. And clearly, if we're doing monitoring and evaluation, it is clear that Nigeria is not anywhere near this standard. And if we look at other African countries, we should applaud Rwanda, we should applaud Kenya, we should applaud other countries, Liberia, where we have had a woman president, Zambia, where we have had a woman president, Tanzania, where we have a woman president, Ethiopia with a woman president, but there's need for more. Having a woman president does not necessarily mean that there's gender equality. Let's be clear on that. Also, clearly, important as it is to have the numbers in parliament, what is also necessary that we need to fight for is true gender equality that runs all through society, beyond just those women who are in those powerful positions. So the question is, how are increases in representation of women feeding into the empowerment of women across the board, such that, for me, we have parity? This is the challenge. And quotas will help us to get there faster than waiting for hearts and minds to change. Another factor I want to talk about is the impact of war. That war fatigue can be a factor that makes women passive because there is harsh and brutal treatment meted out to some women and girls. But on the other hand, we see from both Rwanda and Liberia and other examples in our continent that after periods of conflict, there might be some openness to women's leadership. So there are many obstacles that I have identified. We must address these challenges to promote gender equality, to humanize the state, and to foster sustainable development and peace. Now, let me turn to gender-based violence. And I'm going to draw on African feminist perspectives on violence against women. Radical African feminism portrays men as inherently discriminatory and sexist, often associating them with physical and psychological violence against women. This perspective emphasizes the lack of prospects for improvement in gender relations for a good long time. Now, if we consider that the World Economic Forum has said that humanity would not achieve pay parity between men and women for like 200 years. This is a very violent thing because it's not about somebody hitting somebody, but if you deny people the resources and the economic capacity that they need, it is a form of structural violence. Okay, so let's be clear. We need to also look at neo-colonial poverty as contributing to the dehumanization of women, and also men's aggression when they displace reaction to their own oppression. So they're feeling oppressed, and then they oppress whoever is within their scope of control. Solidarity among women is viewed as a possible source of solace because it enables intercultural alliances to counter gender-based violence. So, this intercultural solidarity can be within nations, because if we take notice, African countries are actually multinational, that there are many ethnicities, and there's a need to build cross-ethnic alliances. There's also a need to build cross-national alliances, cross-regional alliances within the continent. And then, let's be clear, the diaspora is now the sixth region according to the African Union. So there's a need to include the diaspora in these considerations. Marginalization and external factors is also an issue. The marginalization of women of African descent globally is the result of externally generated factors, including religious paternalism and sexism, Western hegemony, paternalism, and sexism, I've said this before, as well as the processes, historical and, thankfully over and done with, elements that persist as a result of the enslavement and colonization of African people. So enslavement and colonialism marginalized African womanhood and also denied African men the power to protect women's custodial rights. 5. Western sexism. Through the lens of Western patriarchy, African women's agency and images became distorted and ridiculed. Western sexism confused the relationship between women and nature, restricting women to weak, ineffectual, juvenile roles. So now about structural violence. As I said, this is about systemic ways in which social structures harm individuals. This is a key factor that affects gender equality. Structural violence disproportionately affects girls and women due to gender-based discrimination and poverty. For example, Boko Haram, the insurgent terrorist group in Nigeria, exemplifies patriarchal nationalism because it treats women purely as mere vessels for procreation, and it uses them as sex slaves and unpaid domestic labor. Let's also focus on the role of the state. African states have been known to use political terror and violence to impose order in a way that affects gender relations and limit political, social, and economic freedoms. Another factor, unequal power dynamics. This involves patriarchal governance systems and structural inequalities, contributing to the marginalization and trivialization of women. It hinders their access, therefore, to decision-making positions and This is a limit on their agency, it's a limit on their choice, it's a limit on their power. There's also direct violence against women in elections. When elections are corrupt and gendered to favor men, and there's a lack of accountability, there are human rights abuses against women, and this happens not just during the election, but throughout the electoral cycle. Another factor, the continuity of patriarchal traditional practices despite vestiges of modernity. Colonialism shaped many of the gender roles in our continent in the late 19th century based on Victorian values that segregated men and women into public and private spheres. It was believed that men can come out in public and exercise power in political systems, in the economy, and in social relations. It was also assumed that women are not supposed to do anything similar, that they should belong in the private sphere. This has become ramified. That is, it's now, the frame that people use to say where women belong and where men belong. But let's be clear, there was a history before colonization, and in historical research that excavates women's history, has been shown that this assumption that the women should be relegated into the domestic sphere is not what the experience was universally in African society before colonization. And, there's good work by scholars like Professor Bolanle Awe, apart from Professor Steady, late Nina Emma Mba, there's work by many other scholars that show us evidence of women's power in the pre-colonial era. I think many of us need to get familiar with this so that we help to push back against and debunk the idea that our society, women don't ever have power. So there's a historical context that we should have, that during the colonial era, in the African continent, women experienced a loss of political power because they were excluded from formal political systems, and this disrupted traditional structures that offered them some recourse or protections. Gender-based violence can hinder women from aspiring to leadership, and it can create a climate of fear. It can limit access to resources and reinforce harmful gender stereotypes. There are many forms of gender-based violence. There are sexual forms, there are physical forms, there are psychological forms, there are economic forms of gender-based violence. And sometimes in situations of war, I think oftentimes I should say, women endure gender-based violence like rape, like, enforced domestic servitude, and use, in ways that are akin to being enslaved, in ways that men don't experience wars. So we see elements of this in the civil wars and political conflict in our continent, where young women are raped, where they are subjected to forced marriages and domestic servitude. In this kind of situation, education, participation in the economy, and ability to access power and justice are very negatively impacted. And this happens in gender-specific ways that really disadvantage women. Hence, the importance of the UN Women, Peace and Security resolutions that forbid the use of rape as an instrument of war, and also directly addresses the criminality of gender-based violence of many sorts. The key aspects of gender-based violence include the following. First, there's an impact on women's leadership in three different ways. The first being that gender-based violence can hinder women from aspiring to leadership positions because there's a climate of fear and pervasive insecurity. So for their own protection, for their ability to live their lives in peace, women might shun leadership. Second, it limits access to resources and reinforces gender stereotypes and perpetuates inequality, thereby undermining women's credibility as leaders. There's also media bashings as a form of gender-based violence that can deter women from seeking leadership roles. In this day of cutting-edge social media, this problem has intensified significantly because there's bullying, there's silencing, there's all kinds of unleashing of terror on women to keep them away from the public sphere. All right, so let me now turn to the relationship between power and choice. The relationship between power and choice for women in Africa is complex because power, as I said before, influences the scope of choices available, and the choices that women make influences their access to power. We should recognize that this is a very nuanced relationship. Okay, so I'm going to talk about several aspects of this. So I'm going to just number them as I go. First, power is a precursor to choice. When women have power, they are more likely to be able to exercise their choices. Historically in Africa, women enjoyed a level of equality and individual legal authority, including ruling ancient empires. There were women pharaohs in Egypt. There's Kanem Borno that has a history of women's leadership and women's rule. There were female monarchs in Ife, Oyo, and if we really look, you would find evidence of this. So I think as a result of some of the work that women scholars have done, we know about Queen Amina of Zauzau. We know about Inikbi, or we know about also the institution of dual monarchy among some of our communities and ethnic groups. The Ondo, among the Yoruba, still have this tradition of dual monarchy. So do Onitsha Igbo people. So let us stop this belief that women in our society never exercised power, because because historically there's evidence, and then there's continuation in contemporary times, even though both for the males and female monarchs, there has been substantial reduction in power as a result of the imposition of the European-style state due to colonization. Second, okay, another thing we should realize is that historically, women exercise the kinds of power that gave them some measure of equality in certain respects, individual legal authority, and rulership of ancient empires. And many of them did this while still asserting their role as mothers, as providers, and also as inheritors of significant property. Second, choice is a means to power. Women's choices, such as pursuing an education and then making that education relevant to the woman's lived experience, pursuing careers or political office can lead to empowerment and greater access to power. Choices related to motherhood and family can also be a source of power. I want to argue that as women are mobilized and become more aware of their power and they challenge structures of domination, more women can strive for power and leadership in the family, in community, in the ethnic groups, and at all levels of the state, all through our continent. Third, there are limitations on choice due to the lack of power. In many parts of the world, women are restricted in their choices due to a lack of power within the structure of society. And many countries show discrepancies in gender equality, limiting women's ability to hold assets or enter into contracts. 4 is the double bind that societal expectations and gender stereotypes limit women's choices and access to power. 5th are the cultural and social norms. Cultural and social norms significantly impact women's choices and their ability to exercise power. The obstacle to women's leadership is strongly cultural, and men and women are encouraged to believe that women should not exercise power. This should be resisted, and people should be educated into forsaking this kind of obstacle. It is possible. The impact of colonialism. Colonialism disrupted African indigenous power structures and imposed new limitations on women's choices. Colonial rule had deleterious effects on women in Africa, in the political, legal, economic, educational, and social spheres. I argue that colonial rule led to a loss of political power for women and excluded them from political systems and economic opportunities. And, due to these disadvantages, women are yet to recover and to have access to power in a manner that is commensurate with their size as a proportion of the population. 7th is religion. Religious ideologies can influence the scope of choices available to women and their access to power. When the elements of religion that are emphasized are those that say that women should not aspire to anything but managing their homes. Women should always be submissive to men. Women should not be leading where you have men, and so on and so forth. Motherhood. Motherhood can be a source of power and influence for women, but it can also be restrictive because if a woman is solely responsible for all the child care, all the family care, all the elder care, and the struggle of stretching financial resources to take care of everybody, it can be overwhelming. So, the ideology of motherhood in place can either help or hinder women's aspirations for leadership, depending on the context. So, what we want is an ideology of motherhood that says that motherhood should not be individual, that it takes a village, and then that we provide the equitable resources that mothers need for them to participate actively as agents with power, with voice, with resources that enable them to exercise power. Conflict can be a catalyst that opens up political spaces for women and create opportunities for them to exercise leadership and power. Security Council Resolution 1325 called for women to play an important role in ensuring the end of conflict and promoting peace and security. My question is, how many countries are taking this seriously? 10. The Queen Mother Paradigm. The Queen Mother Paradigm demonstrates a mechanism for balancing and distributing power. It highlights the potential for women to wield authority. Although specific to some African communities, such as the Akan and the Benin, the power distribution and balancing elements of it can be tailored to fit other contexts. In addition, there are lessons to learn from institutions such as Iyalode. Iyalodes in the Nigerian Yoruba context are women, titled women, who have also economic power, controlling trade and commerce in the marketplaces, and also with significant indigenously, before colonization, they had significant power structurally to influence politics, to also play roles that demonstrate that power belongs equally to males and females. So, the elements foregrounding women's power in these institutions could be embraced and or incorporated in other social contexts. The work of scholars including Professor Bolanle Awe, late Professor Nina Emma Mba, Professor Nakanyike Musisi, Professor Amina Mama, Professors Edna Bay and Nancy Hafkin, and so many others are rich sources of knowledge about previously buried women's history that give evidence of women's power. 11. Education and awareness. Education, combined with an awareness of rights and responsibilities of women, are crucial elements that enable women to make informed choices and exercise their power effectively. Birthright is important, but if two people have the birthright to become leaders and one is more educated and aware, she stands a better chance. 12. Economic independence. Economically active women tend to present a more dynamic leadership. So emphasis should be placed on the social and economic strengths of women that enable them to take control. We can make too much of this because economic empowerment that is not connected with the politics of solidarity might not give women what they need to be truly autonomous. So we need to combine economic independence with also building a solidarity structure where women support women, especially when they're embattled and they're being targeted and they're being stereotyped and they're being kept away from power. We need role models. The presence of female role models and the highlighting of positive stories can inspire women to action. There's a need for solidarity. Women need to work together and transcend the class system to achieve greater power and influence. Another thing, religion should not be allowed to divide us. Ethnicity should not be allowed to divide us. Nationality should not be allowed to divide us. So women should build cross alliances across all these boundaries and, schisms that have been used conventionally to divide us. I argue that as long as men have a monopoly on power, its nature and distribution would remain unchanged. And this monopoly must be challenged both by those who hold it and those who should share in its distribution. The latter, because they are the ones who are disadvantaged, should be the ones that take the lead. One of the scholars that I draw upon, Musa Dube, highlights that African women writers are reclaiming and redefining their heritage against patriarchal and colonial power. The essence of this is that literature and telling our own stories they're very important elements of the struggle that we need to engage. Power influences the scope of choices available to women, therefore, and the choices that women make influence their access to power. Cultural and social norms, colonialism, and religion significantly impact women's choices and their ability to exercise power. Education and awareness of rights and responsibilities are crucial in enabling women to make informed choices and exercise their power effectively. Now I'm going to turn to possible solutions. Here are my recommendations for addressing gender-based violence. They're fourfold. One is ending discrimination through legal and substantive protection. Two, improving security, especially in schools, to protect young girls and young women from violence. Third, implementing gender-sensitive electoral practices and addressing violence against women in politics. Four, we need societal transformation. Transformative African feminism emphasizes that we must overcome discriminatory gender structures and also women's participation in their own victimization. So let me go through this in more detail. Gender-based violence is a significant impediment to women's leadership and overall well-being in Africa, and by implication, Nigeria. This violence is rooted, as I have said, in historical, cultural, and socio-economic factors, including colonialism, patriarchal norms, and structural inequalities. Addressing gender-based violence requires comprehensive strategies, including legal and policy reforms, challenging discriminatory norms, promoting women's empowerment, and ensuring accountability for perpetrators. Recommendations and perspectives on solutions to address gender-based violence are made primarily within the context of African feminism and the specific challenges faced by women in African societies. My recommendations range from societal transformation and women's solidarity to addressing neo-colonial influences and structural inequalities. So let me go into this in more detail. Potential solutions and recommendations for addressing gender-based violence. Number one, social transformation. We have to engage in promoting the idea that women's participation in their own victimization can be surmounted. This approach calls for the evolution of new men and women who will make possible the transformation of the prevalent misogynist gender relations. We must advocate for comprehensive efforts to promote gender equality and women's rights all through the continent, and I dare say, really in Nigeria, including addressing structural violence and the persistence of patriarchal norms. Second, we must challenge structures of domination. This involves challenging traditional gender roles, and some African feminists have argued that we should jettison gender-specific roles and the classic division of labor within the family to foster a more egalitarian society. I want to emphasize the importance of recovering and understanding African traditions that invest women with the right to hold and exercise power, as well as challenging norms that perpetuate gender-based violence. There is nothing intrinsic to being a woman that confines women into a perpetual state of disadvantage where they're treated as second-class citizens. Women's solidarity is also important. Radical African feminist texts suggest sisterhood or solidarity among women as a possible source of solace and a vague anchor of hope. So, intercultural solidarity is important. And, this can go all through the spectrum, as I have said, beyond ethnicity, beyond nation, beyond religion, beyond all the divides. There can also be, solidarity with Western feminisms if they free themselves from the West and gender centrism and the paternalistic tendencies that come from Western ideas of what human life should be like. We need to address neo-colonial poverty because neo-colonial poverty is responsible for the dehumanization of men and women that turn people into very aggressive modes of action. And men's aggressive actions against women tend to escalate as a result of some elements of poverty. So, giving people the resources they need so that they have human security can also contribute to reducing violence in our societies. We need to further recognize women's agency that women should turn their backs on participating in their own victimization. And, a lot of complaints are made by women on women discrimination. This can be overcome. It is incumbent on women to take the initiative. And many of the literatures written by African feminists show, through literary exposition, how this could be facilitated. So we should read more. International solidarity is important. I mean, we should make moves to connect with women across the globe and build solidarity. But this should not be at the expense of being subsumed by such overtures to a perpetual, again, second-class citizenship. International solidarity of women is only possible when everybody comes to the table with humility and a willingness to work together on previous challenges in a way that gives voice and agency to all of us. We need to raise awareness about privileges, and relinquish some of the privileges we have that enable us to benefit from patriarchy and disadvantage other women, because we should all come across all the boundaries and collectively fight patriarchy, and we should also fight neocolonialism and racism, ending discrimination and ensuring legal protection. Very important. We need to end all forms of discrimination through legal and substantive protection. I've mentioned this before, and address structural inequalities that dictate a subordinate role for women. It's important to support laws that elevate the status of women in the economic, social, and political systems. We need to live up to the spirit of international, regional, national legislations and constitutions. And we must improve security and safety in schools, in society in general. We must also support this by implementing gender-sensitive practices in our electoral system, in social life, in political life, in the economy, that offer equity to previously marginalized and disadvantaged groups. Women are a big part of these disadvantaged and, marginalized groups within society. So my recommendations include affirmative action laws, mentorship programs, and addressing violence against women wherever it raises its ugly head, whether it's in the political system, in social life, in the economic sphere. Economic empowerment, following up on this, is very important. We need to build economic power that is defined as ownership of the means of production, number one, control of the gains from one's own labor, number two, and coalition building that enables for the previous two things to be possible. You can see elements of this in the Sustainable Development Goals, emphasis on gender equality being the goal that should run across the board and influence all other goals. So, education and awareness are very important. We must support education for girls and women. Adult education is part of this. Also, civic education. In addition to these recommendations, I want us to be clear that the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action is a global agenda to promote gender equality and women's rights. Nigeria, we can't say Nigeria hasn't made a little bit of progress, but there are still significant gaps, including glaringly low women's political participation in decision making, and then the persistence of violence against women. What are the strategies that women have used to gain political power? Well, one strategy, I'm going to talk about 6, is leveraging motherhood and traditional roles. 2, building alliances and networks. 3, utilizing indigenous institutions. 4, engaging in political activism and advocacy. 5, participating in peace and conflict resolution and peace building in the post-conflict environment. 6, seeking education, professional advancement, and connecting one's education to one's needs as a social being that is interested in one's own self-actualization. Various strategies, so it's clear that various strategies are used by African women to gain political power. We saw great evidence of this in the work of Professor Philomena Chioma-Steady and some of the other women scholars that I have referenced. The strategies women use encompassing the leveraging of traditional roles, building of alliances, using indigenous institutions, engaging in political activism, and participating in peace building, conflict resolution, and also seeking education and professional advancement, all directed towards self-actualization. So the key strategies I'm going to talk about in more detail. Leveraging motherhood and traditional roles. Women strategically use the symbol of motherhood to mobilize support. They project a leadership style compatible with motherhood, emphasizing moral integrity, altruism, caring, and sacrificing for the good of society. The concept of quote-unquote mothering the nation serves as an indigenous model for understanding female leadership, prioritizing values like caring, continuity, and peace. Second, building alliances and networks. Women form strong alliances in the most unlikely ways. Some women form these through arranged marriages, and they develop alliances. And, women also have shown that they build significant alliances through civil society organizations, through strengthening of networks among women at the local, regional, and continental, as well as international levels. This is all very crucial. These networks help women to build cohesion and increase their collective power. Third, utilizing indigenous institutions. Women, in the indigenous traditions have been shown to participate in political decision through a dual sex system, which is based on gender representation. We can bring this to feature in the present. Women also wield power through their leadership roles in female secret societies and may utilize the Queen Mother paradigm, the Yalode paradigm, all other paradigms, Umuada, that are interpreted in positive ways to legitimate the idea of the entitlement of women to parallel leadership. That is not in any way inferior to the power that men exercise. It is also important to engage in relentless political activism and advocacy. women must tenaciously and actively work towards constitutional and legislative changes to promote gender equality. They must protest when necessary peacefully but tenaciously and campaign in alliance with other women's associations. They must do this in advocacy for affirmative action and legislation that enables and ensures women's equal participation in elections, in decision making, politically, socially, and in the economic sphere. They must also engage, and they have, but they must not be tired of engaging in sensitization efforts involving various stakeholders, including political parties, civil society organizations, traditional institutions, religious institutions, and in every single sphere of life. Fifth, women participating in peace building and conflict resolution. Women have played a vital role in conflict resolution and in promoting peace and security. They serve as mediators and negotiators. They monitor and advocate for the application of international instruments on peace. They must not tire because the work is tremendous and it is, we're yet to make the breakthroughs that we need in a consistent way that enhances human security across the board all through our continent. Women must seek education and professional advancement. They must pursue this vigorously and, acquire the qualifications that they need to enhance their capabilities and their credibility. Women must overcome the obstacles that prevent them from entering into politics. They must demand affirmative action policies where quotas for women is part of the mix. This must be combined with regular competitive elections, involvement in regular competitive elections where women are given the equitable access to resources that they need to compete meaningfully. There's a need to challenge gender hierarchies. And some people have said, let's found all-female political parties. Well, I have to say also, I hope there's awareness that, this is also a historical fact. There was a Nigerian Women's Party. People should go and look at what was happening during the era of nationalist struggle against colonial rule. And some of the work of Mrs. Fumilayo Ransom Kuti also showed that women in that time, in the 1950s, were thinking seriously about organizing as women across ethnic boundaries in Nigeria. So let's be clear, this is possible. And within the political parties that exist, women need to go after ensuring that there's parity in power for males and females in those institutions. Now, finally, I'm not done, but in this section, the instruments of mobilization and communication, such as dances, songs, satire, gender role reversals, and militancy, as well as informal kinship, markets, and community networks, are all avenues through which women can, harmonize and strategize and build coalitions that challenge patriarchy. Gender-based violence has an impact on women's leadership efforts it's also connected to various forms of oppression. However, there are potential solutions, all of which require more work, better organizing, and strategizing, as well as tenacity. We need to properly contextualize and employ African feminism, because African feminism includes the idea of cooperation or complementarity with men, the affirmation of motherhood and family. It critiques patriarchal manifestations in African societies. It addresses gender roles within the context of various oppressive mechanisms like racism, neocolonialism, and socio-economic exclusion. African women have redefined the global women's agenda by broadening its scope to include political and economic issues. One very useful and very short effort that is very accessible was done by late Peg Snyder, Dr. Margaret Snyder, who talked about African women's contributions to the global feminist movement. So there's no homogeneous African feminism. Instead, let us embrace African feminisms from multiple angles, understanding the core tenets, the different forms, differences in relationship to Western feminism, so that we can properly contextualize approaches to issues such as women's leadership, gender-based violence, and the dynamics of power and choice. Okay, there's some common threads that you see in African feminism. They include the following: diversity and core tenets. It's crucial to recognize the plurality of feminisms in Africa due to the diverse social realities on the continent. In African feminism, critically examines African gender relations and strives to transform gender relationships in African societies in a way that improves the situation of women. It emphasizes cooperation with men, affirms motherhood and family, and offers nuanced critiques of patriarchal structures. Okay, so there are paradigms of African feminism that one can identify. This critique of gender relations that they make, that includes the cooperation or complementarity with men, affirmation of motherhood and family, and differentiated criticisms of patriarchal manifestations. There's also intersectionality. African feminism addresses gender roles within the context of various oppressive mechanisms like racism, neocolonialism, and socio-economic exclusion, exceeding the race-class gender approach in African American feminism. So let's kind of talk about three currents of African feminist literature: the reformist, the transformative, and the radical. I've mentioned them before. Let me just talk about them to a greater degree now. Okay. We need to recognize that, there are differences, as I have said, in terms of how African feminists have approached the struggle that we're in and what we can do better to fight patriarchy. Reformist African feminism seeks to negotiate with patriarchal society for greater female autonomy. But, there's a degree to which there's an acceptance of the existing social order. Transformative African feminism critiques patriarchal structures and assumes that men are capable of change. And then it gives a depiction of idealized transformations. I'm drawing here from the work of Ant, who is a Scandinavian scholar that has looked at African feminism in African literatures. There's also radical African feminism that argues that men intrinsically discriminate against women. And it portrays a very pessimistic view and has little expression of hope for transformation. So one thing that is clear is that the African alternatives to Western feminism. Africans have conceptualized these alternatives partly in protest against the white history of and the white domination within feminism. These alternatives consider the material circumstances and cultural histories of African societies. Africans found it problematic when Africa is usually lumped together with the third world and reprimanded from a paternalistic, West-centric point of view. These difficulties have led to the theorization of alternative conceptions to feminism, such as Professor Chikwenye Ogunyemi's concept of African womanism, Professor Mary Kola-Wole's womanism, late Professor Molara Ogundipe Leslie's Stewanism, or social transformation, including women in Africa, and Professor Nnemeka Obioma Nnemeka's nego-feminism, that is feminism of negotiation. So African women have contributed to redefining the global women's agenda. They have played a significant role in redefining the women's agenda by broadening its scope to include political and economic issues, in addition to gender equality. They have emphasized the basic human values belonging to all of us and challenged unjust systems like apartheid and global economic inequalities. This contrasts with the Western women's liberation concept that initially focused on sexual equality and individualistic pursuits. Contextualizing violence against African women is also something that African feminists have done. They have linked violence against women to various other factors, including patriarchy, socioeconomic status, neocolonialism, and solidarity among women. African feminism has also addressed other oppressive mechanisms. It aims at discussing gender roles in the context of other oppressive mechanisms such as racism, neocolonialism, cultural, culturally based discrimination against women, imperialism, socioeconomic exclusion and exploitation, gerontocracy, religious fundamentalism, as well as dictatorial and/or corrupt systems. In sum, African feminism is a multifaceted and evolving concept that seeks to address the unique challenges and opportunities facing African women, often in contrast to Western feminist perspectives. It emphasizes the importance of cultural context, of collaboration with men, and addressing multiple forms of oppression. There are efforts that are being made by African feminist activists that we ought to applaud. What we need to do more of is to build a critical mass of conscious, engaged, and tenacious activists for gender equality who are equally committed and firmly so to female leadership. What are the factors that spur African women's activism? Well, several factors have spurred African women's activism, including historical participation, economic protests, independence movements, cross-border organizing, the desire to contribute to new nations, the influence of the United Nations, and the broadening of the women's agenda. So a six-part set of factors. Let me name them again. 1, historical participation in social, economic, and political activities. 2, protests against unjust labor regulations and economic policies. 3, active roles in independence movements. 4, cross-border organizing. 5, desire to contribute to their young free nations. 6, influence of the United Nations. So let me go into these factors with more deliberation. The key factors that have spurred African women's activism include historical participation, number 1. African women have actively participated in the social, economic, and political activities of their societies since pre-colonial times, including in decision-making roles in public life. I'm going to take a pause on the key factors that spurred African women's activism. Second, economic protests. Protests against unjust labor regulations and economic policies has historically fueled women's activism. Women protested forced labor, unfair prices, and the diversion of fertile lands to cash crops, which led to things like child malnutrition and increased workloads for women. Third, women participated in independence movements. They played active and influential roles in these movements, often comprising the majority of members. They sought to participate fully in their new nations after experiencing struggle. Such interest has not been rewarded with access or easy access. Women also have, in the continent, engaged in cross-border organizing. You saw this in the 1950s and early 1960s, when women in Africa began to organize across national borders to prepare to participate in their new nations. There was an All-Africa Women's Conference, later renamed the Pan-African Women's Organization. This was formed in Mali in 1961, and there were regional seminars beginning in 1962. There has always been a desire by African women to contribute. African women have wanted to contribute to their young and free nations. They mobilized women all over their countries so that they could organize themselves to become useful citizens for the development of their nations. Women also are responsible for the push that has led to recognizing the importance of women's role, because there was a growing understanding that the duties, responsibilities, and rights of citizenship should not be restricted by sexual barriers. The influence of the United Nations. African women found the United Nations system very helpful and useful, particularly the Economic Commission for Africa, or ECA, which became a guardian of their movement and a vehicle to influence their own governments. The broadening of the women's agenda was also engaged by African women and other non-Western women, because they included political and economic issues. And they intended to promote basic human values that were denied by unjust systems such as apartheid and the inequities of the world economy. This contrasted with the Western feminist movement's initial focus on just individual rights and equality. African women also drew attention to the issue of double colonization, that they are doubly oppressed by colonial as well as patriarchal forces coming from cultural practices. So, African post-colonial feminism, I dare say, and I agree with Musa Dube in this, and other scholars, that African post-colonial feminism has been engaged in a quest to address the complexity of the oppression that African women have faced in an intersectional way. Another factor is economic empowerment, that African women have been active in conflict resolution, governance, and economic empowerment. They are involved, as I've said before, in peace initiatives, advocating for representation also in national legislatures, and working assiduously towards economic independence. On tradition, I want to say it is important that we recover and understand African traditions that invest women with the right to hold and exercise power. I want us to be wary of that automatic tendency to assume that African tradition is a zone of women's marginalization and oppression. There is a lot of research that's been done. I think we need to access and understand it and use that research to our advantage. Gender equality is something also that African women have worked towards. And the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action is a global agenda to promote gender equality and women's rights. And you've seen evidence of African women and African feminist work to bring to reality many of the recommendations made by Beijing Platform of Action. In Africa, the advancement of female leadership is deeply intertwined with power dynamics, the ability to exercise choice, opportunities for participation, and the pervasive threat of gender-based violence. Power influences the scope of choices available to women, and the choices women make influence their access to power. Confronting gender-based violence and dismantling the structural inequalities that perpetuate it is crucial to empower women and enhance their leadership capabilities and participation in Africa. So here are the key takeaways that I want to encourage us to keep in mind. 1, breaking the cycle of disadvantage is vital. Gender-based violence creates a climate of fear and insecurity and limits women's access to essential resources. It hinders leadership development. Gender-based violence also reinforces harmful gender stereotypes and undermines women's credibility and authority. Second, agency arises from choice. Women's strategic choices, such as pursuing education and making that education meaningful to their life, and seeking political office, leveraging motherhood, building alliances, and utilizing indigenous institutions can lead to empowerment and greater access to power. Third, challenging power structures. Overcoming male dominance, cultural constraints, and disunity among women are key to female leadership. Challenging structures of domination that marginalize women is essential. 4, let's address structural violence. Structural violence is a pervasive issue that underlies many forms of inequality and insecurity. When we address structural violence by redistributing power, investing in education, ensuring equal access and equitable access to economic opportunities, it is important to realize that this would actually foster transformation. 5, let's redefine leadership. I'm going to remind us that Professor Philomena Chioma Steady emphasizes the inclusion of qualities of motherhood such as nurturance, compassion, and protection in African indigenous definitions of leadership, and that the mothering the nation approach humanizes the state and it can be used as a strategy, an effective strategy. 6, there's a need to overcome the colonial legacy. Colonialism negatively impacted indigenous female leadership in Africa because it eliminated women rulers, marginalized traditional female authority. Overcoming this legacy requires a comprehensive approach that transcends race, class, and colonial legacies. Further, number 7, let's embrace African feminism because it critically examines gender relations and strives to transform gender relationships in African societies to improve the situation of women. It emphasizes cooperation with men. It affirms motherhood and family, and it offers nuanced critiques of patriarchal structures. 8. Let's enforce legal protection and end discrimination. It's critical that we end all forms of discrimination through legal and substantive protection, as well as address structural inequalities that dictate a subordinate role for women. 9. Let's promote education and awareness and support education for girls and women. This is critical. 10. Let's foster international solidarity among women, and let's work towards this goal. 11. Let's implement gender-sensitive practices, because it's critical that we have these gender-sensitive practices across the board so that we can have systems that equitably provide opportunities to women to participate on an equal footing with men in all aspects of life. We must also take seriously the need to eliminate violence against women in politics. So finally, to truly empower women and enhance their leadership capabilities and participation, societies must actively confront gender-based violence and dismantle structural inequalities that perpetuate gender-based violence by addressing the interconnected factors that I have identified. We can create an environment where women are empowered to lead, where they participate fully, where they're able to exercise their choices without fear of violence or discrimination. The works that I used are numerous, and I'm going to post them in the video on YouTube so that people can access them and consult them and use them. Thank you very much. This has been such a pleasure.